1943. The Baltic wind howled across the coast of Peenemünde, carrying the smell of salt and gasoline. Inside a long concrete bunker, German engineers crowded around a steel monster that lay stretched across its launch rail, the V-2 rocket. Its metal body gleamed under yellow lights, and the air vibrated with tension. When the ignition switch was pulled, the world around them shook. Fire exploded from the base, sand lifted from the ground, and in a heartbeat, the rocket vanished into the clouds. Silence followed, then distant thunder as it tore through the upper sky. The men cheered. Some raised their fists. Others clapped each other on the back. They had done what no one else had achieved, sent a weapon faster than sound, higher than any plane could fly. Werner von Braun smiled faintly, his eyes glowing behind his goggles. Around him, the younger engineers joked about the Americans, calling their rockets toys and their scientists amateurs. To them, the United States was a land of factories and tractors, not innovation. "They'll never catch up," one laughed. "They're too busy building refrigerators." The room filled with laughter that mixed with the fading echo of the launch. They believed they had seen the future, and it wore the swastika, but far across the Atlantic, the laughter had already reached American ears. In a small workshop buried in the New Mexico desert, a group of exhausted men gathered around a cracked table scattered with engine parts and half-burned blueprints. The walls were thin, the floor covered in sand, and the heat inside could melt patience. They were scientists, some inspired by Robert Goddard, others by pure defiance. Their rockets barely lifted off the ground, sputtering and falling like wounded birds. But they refused to stop. Every failure was a lesson, every scorch mark on their test stand a reminder that pride could be burned away, but determination could not. One of them, a quiet engineer named Jack, kept a notebook stained with grease. On one page, beneath a sketch of a failed rocket, he wrote a single line. "They laugh now, but the sky will remember us." By night, they worked under the pale desert moon, their shadows long and thin against the dunes. The war in Europe was still raging, but their war was here, in formulas, metal, and flame. They didn't have the polished laboratories of the Germans, or the applause of the Reich. What they had was hunger. And though none of them could see it yet, those flickering flames in the desert would soon rise higher than the laughter from Peenemünde. The arrogance that echoed in that German bunker would one day be swallowed by thunder. Thunder forged not in pride, but in perseverance. For now, the sky was quiet, but the wind carried a promise, one that would soon turn laughter into silence and fire into vengeance. The months rolled into 1944, and while the desert sun beat mercilessly on the sand of New Mexico, the men of the rocket project hardly noticed. Their shirts were soaked with sweat, their eyes bloodshot from sleepless nights, but the spirit inside that hangar burned brighter than the flames that sometimes swallowed their experiments. They had one mission, to catch up to the Germans who thought they were gods of the sky. Every morning began with the smell of fuel and the sharp echo of failure. When a rocket blew apart, they didn't curse. They simply picked up the pieces, scribbled notes on clipboards, and tried again. The ground around their test stand was littered with fragments of melted steel and dreams, yet somehow those fragments became lessons. Jack, the quiet engineer with the grease-stained notebook, had become a symbol of persistence. "The Germans had their head start," he muttered one night, tightening a bolt under a dim bulb. "But we've got time, and we've got purpose." His partner looked up, covered in soot, and replied, "Purpose doesn't make rockets fly." Jack smiled faintly. "No," he said, "but it keeps the fire lit." Far away, that fire's opposite raged over London. Across the English Channel, German rockets screamed through the stratosphere. The first V-2 landed without warning, leveling a block in South London. No sirens, no defense, only sudden destruction. People on the streets never saw it coming. Survivors said the world went white, then red, then nothing. Newspapers called it vengeance from the sky. In bunkers below Whitehall, British officials traced the arcs of those rockets, trying to guess where they came from. The only conclusion they reached was that this was beyond anything the Allies possessed. The Germans had created the first supersonic weapon, a machine that ignored gravity and mercy alike. In Washington, the mood was grim. Generals gathered around tables, eyes on grainy photos of cratered streets. America had factories, ships, planes, but now it faced a weapon it couldn't stop. Roosevelt's advisors demanded a countermeasure, but there was none. When one general slammed his fist on the table and asked, "Who can build us something like this?" Someone quietly mentioned a group of scientists working out in the desert. A hush fell over the room. The general frowned, recalling the name, something about experimental propulsion. "Are they getting results?" he asked. The answer came reluctantly. "Not yet, sir, but they might be our only chance." And so, funds poured into the desert. The men who had been dismissed as dreamers were suddenly given trucks, parts, and soldiers to guard the perimeter. The mood changed. Failure was no longer just disappointment. It was a matter of national pride. The military demanded deadlines, the scientists demanded patience, and between the two stood the thin line of possibility. "We can't build a V2 overnight," one of them said during a tense meeting. "Then don't sleep," the colonel replied coldly. That night, the desert sky turned orange again. A test rocket roared, climbed 15 feet, and spun wildly before bursting into a fountain of fire. The ground trembled, and silence followed. No one moved for a moment. Then Jack scribbled another note and said, "We're closer." The others stared at him as if he'd gone mad, but deep down, they believed him. Every explosion, every misfire, every sleepless night, it all pointed towards something greater. They didn't just want to match the Germans. They wanted to outdo them. Meanwhile, across the sea, the men at Peenemünde grew overconfident. Their V2s terrorized cities, but the war itself was shifting. Allied bombers darkened the skies over Europe. The Reich was being squeezed from all sides, yet the scientists clung to their rockets like priests to their altar. They believed technology could save them, that their genius would outlast defeat. Von Braun still smiled when he walked through the corridors, telling his staff that history would remember them as pioneers. He didn't yet know that British spies had mapped the coordinates of Peenemünde, nor that bombers were preparing to erase it from the earth. On a humid August night, the sky above Peenemünde ignited. Hundreds of bombers dropped tons of explosives in a single wave. The roar of engines drowned out every thought, every prayer. The ground split open, laboratories crumbled, and men who once mocked the Americans ran for their lives. Flames devoured the research halls, and the V2 prototypes exploded one by one. When the smoke cleared, the once proud test site was a graveyard of twisted metal and shattered pride. The news reached New Mexico days later. Jack read it out loud to the team. "Peenemünde destroyed." The words hung in the air like prophecy. No one cheered. They just stared at each other, knowing what it meant. The race had turned. The Germans had built their empire of rockets on arrogance. The Americans would build theirs on resilience. From that point on, everything changed. Engineers who once second-guessed themselves now walked taller. They still failed often, but the failures carried purpose. One night, Jack climbed the test platform alone and looked at the stars. He imagined the German scientists somewhere under the same sky, staring up, wondering where it all went wrong. He opened his notebook and wrote, "They reached higher first, but we will go further." By the end of 1944, the tests began to improve. Rockets flew straighter, higher, and longer before falling. They still weren't perfect, but they were no longer jokes. When the first one crossed the upper atmosphere, the entire team erupted in cheers. Dust rose as men hugged, laughed, and shouted into the desert wind. Somewhere, perhaps without knowing, They had taken their first real step toward vengeance, not the kind that destroys cities, but the kind that proves every sneer wrong. That night, a telegram arrived from Washington. "Continue development. You are making history." The message was short, but its weight was enormous. Jack read it twice, folded it neatly, and slipped it into his notebook beside the other pages filled with burned edges and faded ink. Outside, the desert was quiet again, the stars endless and patient. The Americans were still behind, but no longer by much. What none of them could imagine was how this silent competition of mines and metals would soon decide the fate of the skies. The Germans believed their rockets had no equal, but in the lonely heat of the American desert, something new was being born. Something faster, smarter, and destined to change not just the war, but the world. The laughter from Peenemünde had faded, but its echo lingered in every launch. And somewhere beyond that horizon, the sky was already waiting for the answer. When 1945 dawned, the war was entering its final, blood-soaked act. Germany was collapsing, the Allies were advancing, and across the ruined fields of Europe, the echo of artillery was slowly giving way to silence. But inside the minds of the men who once built the Reich's deadliest weapon, there was only fear. Von Braun and his team knew the war was lost, but they also knew that their knowledge was priceless. They had created the most advanced rocket on Earth, and every nation now wanted a piece of it. American forces closed in from the west, the Soviets from the east. To be captured by one meant life in comfort, by the other, a lifetime in a Siberian camp. So, under the cover of night, von Braun gathered his closest engineers, burned their papers, and drove through the ruins toward the American lines, carrying crates filled with blueprints, photographs, and fragments of their rocket dreams. Days later, in a snow-covered valley of Austria, a group of U.S. soldiers stumbled upon a convoy of weary men waving white flags. Their leader introduced himself in perfect English. "My name is Werner von Braun. I would like to surrender to America." That surrender would mark the birth of a secret operation that would change history. Operation Paperclip. When the news reached Washington, it was met with both triumph and unease. These were the same men whose weapons had terrorized London, who had worked for Hitler's war machine. But their minds were now America's most valuable prize. The decision was swift and quiet. Bring them to the United States, erase their Nazi past, and put their genius to work for the future. Within weeks, von Braun and hundreds of his scientists were transported across the ocean, hidden under false titles and secret contracts. Meanwhile, in the deserts of New Mexico, Jack and his team were still toiling away, unaware that their rivals were about to become their colleagues. When the trucks arrived at the base, the Americans stared in disbelief. The very men they had tried to beat, the ones who mocked them years ago, were now walking through their gates wearing American uniforms. Jack stood silently as von Braun extended a hand. "I've read about your work," von Braun said politely. "You have made great progress." Jack looked at him for a moment before replying. "We didn't have much choice." The handshake was firm but cold, the air heavy with something between respect and resentment. From that day forward, the laboratories of White Sands became a strange alliance of former enemies. The Germans brought their designs, their equations, and their discipline. The Americans brought resources, ambition, and a hunger to prove they could outdo the men who once looked down on them. So, together they worked, but there was no equality. Only a quiet race within the same team. When the first reconstructed V2 was rolled out onto the test range, it bore both flags, the memory of the Reich and the promise of the stars. The desert trembled again as the countdown began. The engine ignited, flames roared, and the rocket leapt from the earth, rising higher and faster than anything built before it in America. The German scientists nodded approvingly, but the Americans watched differently. They saw not beauty or pride, but a challenge, proof that there was still further to go. When the rocket disappeared into the clouds and exploded miles above the Earth, everyone applauded, but Jack stayed quiet. "We're still flying their design," he said under his breath. "I want to build something they've never dreamed of." The next months blurred into endless nights of testing and tinkering. The Americans started to modify the V2, changing its fuel mixture, adding new control systems, and experimenting with lighter metals. Slowly, the rockets began to evolve beyond their German origin. They rose higher, faster, more stable. Every success was a small piece of revenge, not through war, but through progress. The Germans who once laughed at American rockets now watched with something they hadn't felt in years: humility. One of them, a younger scientist named Ernst, approached Jack one evening after a flawless test. "When we worked for Berlin," he said quietly, "we thought the future belonged to us." Jack looked at him and replied, "The future doesn't belong to anyone who believes they already have it." By the end of 1946, America had absorbed not just Germany's scientists, but its secrets. Military leaders began planning how these rockets could carry more than just fuel, how they could deliver messages of power across oceans. The laboratories expanded and secrecy deepened. Some of the Germans grew uneasy, realizing their work was no longer about curiosity or exploration. It was about dominance. Von Braun, though, remained calm. "The rocket is just a tool," he said. "It is the hand that wields it that decides what it becomes." Still, even he couldn't ignore what he was seeing. In a single year, American engineers had advanced beyond where the Reich had reached after a decade. Their production lines were unmatched. Their test ranges were endless. They didn't need underground tunnels or forced labor. They had open skies and unlimited steel. Von Braun wrote a letter to a friend back in Germany that would later surface in an archive. "They have done in months what we struggled to do for years. Their strength is not genius, it is persistence." One morning, Jack stood beside a new rocket, taller and sleeker than anything built before. It wasn't a V2 anymore. It was something else. Something born of both rivalry and respect. The sun climbed over the mountains, painting the desert gold. "Ready?" someone called from the tower. Jack raised his hand. "Do it!" The ignition thundered and the rocket surged upward, straight and true, splitting the sky in half. The crowd erupted as it disappeared beyond the clouds, higher than any rocket had ever gone. Von Braun clapped slowly, a faint smile on his face. "Impressive," he murmured. Jack turned toward him and said, "You once called us amateurs." Von Braun nodded. "And now?" Jack asked. The German looked at the smoke rising in the distance. "Now," he said quietly, "I see the future wearing your colors." The two men stood side by side, watching the trail fade into the blue. It wasn't friendship that connected them. It was the knowledge that history had changed hands. The laughter that once echoed through the halls of Peenemünde was gone, replaced by a new sound, the roar of American engines climbing higher than pride could ever reach. As the desert wind carried the last traces of smoke away, Jack closed his notebook and drew one final line under the day's entry. "They gave the world its first rocket. We'll give it the last word." By 1947, the war was over, but the battle for the skies had only begun. The laboratories at White Sands were no longer a collection of makeshift sheds. They had become temples of progress, guarded by soldiers and surrounded by fences topped with barbed wire. The sound of engines filled the desert almost daily, each test louder and sharper than the last. What had started as desperation had now turned into dominance. The Germans who once laughed now walked the corridors quietly, their pride replaced by uneasy respect. Von Braun's team kept to themselves, recording data and adjusting designs, but the Americans were no longer students. They were teachers now, leading the experiments, rewriting the rules, and dreaming beyond the reach of war. Jack had grown leaner, older. The lines around his eyes deepened, carved by sun and sleepless nights. He still carried that same grease-stained notebook, though its pages were nearly full. Inside it were the lessons of every failure and the dreams of every launch. Sometimes, when the others had gone home, he sat on the hood of an army jeep and looked at the empty horizon, thinking about how far they had come from those early days of mockery. "We used to be the joke," he whispered one evening to a fellow engineer. "Now, we're the punchline that hit back." The other man laughed softly. "You think they'll ever admit it?" Jack shrugged. "They don't have to. The sky already did." In the years that followed, rockets began to change from weapons to wonders. The government wanted long-range missiles, but the scientists began dreaming of something higher, something that could touch the edge of space. Every launch now carried two kinds of fuel, liquid oxygen and ambition. The collaboration between Americans and Germans was no longer a rivalry. It was an unspoken acknowledgement that the future belonged to whoever could climb fastest. But in the back of everyone's mind, the shadow of war still lingered. The Cold War was beginning to rise like a new kind of storm. The Soviets had taken their share of German scientists too, and news from Moscow spoke of their own tests, bigger, faster, deadlier. Washington grew nervous. The Americans realized that what started as vengeance was now survival. Each successful launch wasn't just pride. It was insurance against the next enemy. One morning, a convoy arrived, carrying something that made even von Braun fall silent. Under heavy tarps lay the parts of a new creation, a rocket larger than any before it, one that could travel beyond the clouds and return with power the world had never seen. Its name was written in red stencil, Atlas. It wasn't just a rocket. It was the birth of a new era. The engineers stood around it, some whispering, others staring in awe. For Jack, it was the moment he realized the laughter from 1943 had done more than insult them. It had lit a fire that could now reach the heavens. As testing began, the Germans found themselves assisting the very system that once feared them. They calculated trajectories, built fuel injectors, and refined nozzles, all under the American flag. Some of them confessed in private that they were astonished. "We built weapons of terror," one said quietly. "But you are building symbols." Jack turned to him and replied, "Symbols are just weapons that the world can live with." When the first Atlas prototype lifted off, it didn't just climb. It screamed through the desert air like an answer long overdue. It was taller than any V2, faster, and infinitely more powerful. The ground shook, and everyone watching felt it in their bones. Von Braun watched silently, his face half lit by the exhaust's glow. "It's beautiful," he whispered. Jack glanced at him and said, "That's what vengeance looks like when you aim it at the sky instead of people." The years passed quickly. Von Braun eventually moved to Huntsville, Alabama, to lead new programs under NASA's future banner, while Jack stayed in the desert, building and testing. By the 1950s, the same technology that had once terrified Europe now fueled America's rise. Missiles became satellites, and dreams of reaching the moon no longer sounded like fantasies. The Germans had introduced the world to rocket warfare, but the Americans had turned it into rocket wonder. One evening, long after most had gone home, Jack opened his notebook again. The first page, written years ago under a flickering light, read, "They laugh now, but the sky will remember us." He smiled faintly, realizing how true those words had become. He walked out to the test field, where the night was still and vast. In the distance, a rocket stood ready for a morning launch, its silver body gleaming under the moonlight. Jack placed a hand on the cold metal and whispered, "You're our answer. You're their silence." Elsewhere. In a small interview room years later, von Braun sat before a journalist. The reporter asked him what he thought when he first saw American rockets fly higher than his own. Von Braun paused, his eyes distant. "We thought we were masters of the sky," he said softly. But the sky has no masters, only students. He smiled faintly, as if humbled by his own words. By the time the 1960s arrived, those students would send a man to the moon. But even then, the story's roots went back to the deserts of New Mexico. The long nights of failure, the laughter that had once crossed the ocean, and the determination that burned hotter than any rocket flame. What began as a race of pride ended as a lesson in perseverance. The last entry in Jack's notebook came not long before he retired. The handwriting was shaky, the ink faded, but the message was clear. They laughed at our rockets. We answered with the sky. That sentence became a quiet legend among those who worked with him. Years later, when the Saturn V thundered into the heavens carrying Apollo toward the moon, an engineer in the crowd whispered that same line under his breath. The roar of the engines drowned it out, but the meaning remained, a soundless echo stretching back across decades, across continents, from Peenemünde to the desert, from arrogance to awe. The Germans had once called it vengeance when their rockets fell upon cities. But this was a different kind of vengeance. It didn't destroy, it transcended. It turned humiliation into history, failure into flight. The same sky that once swallowed their pride now carried mankind to the stars. And somewhere, perhaps, in the quiet after the roar, the laughter that began in 1943 could still be heard, faint and distant, until it was finally drowned out by thunder.